Hi, my name is Logan, and welcome to the Hong Kong Legends DVD of Game of Death. And starting out, I have to tell you, this film is like a guilty pleasure for me. It was actually the very first Bruce Lee movie that I ever saw, so has a special place in my heart. And I look at it now, and it's like a really good, bad movie. I mean, there's moments that work really well, specifically the action scenes, of course, of Bruce Lee, and the other action scenes choreographed and shot by Sammo Hung, and a lot that doesn't work. This, you notice that there's a few moments of imagery here with the nunchakus before the music kicks in. The reason is because this footage was actually prepared for a re-release of The Big Boss by Golden Harvest, and they found that those frames of footage, that little clip, and decided to put it at the very beginning of the credit sequence for Game of Death, really the 11th hour. So the music was timed to come in with the beginning of these credits, which were executed by Christopher Strong III and his team in LA. And these replaced the credit sequence that's seen on the Chinese version of the film, which is a much simpler affair with little boxes showing Bruce Lee and some of the Bruce Lee doubles used in the film, and some tinted clips of Bruce Lee in action. And the music you're hearing now is a title track composed by John Barry, who composed many of the great James Bond soundtracks and many other great scores as well. On the Chinese version, there's a very syrupy romantic ballad sung by a guy called Roman Tam, Lawman, who is, I think it's fair to say, he's like the Hong Kong equivalent of Elton John. So he was kind of an odd choice, and it was felt that that opening, those credits and that music was not punchy enough to sell this film internationally. So Raymond Chow, the producer of the film, found John Barry, obviously, as good a track record as anybody has in action film score composing, and also went to LA, took all the footage to this production house, and Christopher Strong and his team did a very good job. And it's very classy looking opening credits for the film. I'm sure many of you who've bought this DVD and are listening to the commentary are aware of the history of Game of Death. I'll briefly recap. After Bruce Lee had finished his debut directorial feature, Way of the Dragon, in 1972, he began shooting scenes for a film to be called Game of Death. Seimong Yao Hei. Seimong is death, Yao Hei is game. And a lot of people at the time thought it was tempting fate to have a film with the title Death, so prominent in the title. But, Bruce being Bruce went his own way and shot fight sequences for the film, and then suspended production on Game of Death to shoot Enter the Dragon for Warner Brothers. And then, of course, his untimely demise caught up with him, and he never got to return to shoot the other scenes of Game of Death. And the footage lay there in the archive at Golden Harvest, and had been, pre-sold to Japan. So they kind of had to come up somehow with a complete Game of Death to at least sell to the Japanese market. As Robert Klaus gets solo credit on the international print. On the Hong Kong versions, he and Sammo Hung, Hong Kong Bo, share credit. And this happens with a number of of Golden Harvest titles. The Man from Hong Kong is another one, where Brian Trenchard Smith, an Australian director, gets sole credit on the international prints, and he and the film star, Wong Yu, share credit on the Asian prints. And here we see clips of Bruce Lee fighting Chuck Norris in the film Way of the Dragon. Chuck had actually been offered the role of Steiner, the part that's played in Game of Death by Hugh O'Brien, and had turned it down, so instead they incorporated him in the film in clips from the earlier film he'd shot with Bruce. And I think he threatened legal action with Golden Harvest because of the way his name was featured in the advertising for the film, because he claimed that it gave an impression that he was actually acting in this new film, and of course it was only in these clips that he appears. And the matter was settled out of court, and that was that. There's the voice of the great James Hong there. James Hong, the bad guy in Big Trouble in Little China, did a lot of the ADR work on Game of Death, because the ADR was actually done in the dubbing and syncing for all the English version. The English version of the film was done in LA after the film was done. And James Hong, his voice is very familiar to any fan of American movies with an Asian theme. There's this guy with the red shirt, always looks to me like a country and western singer. And no one who looks like that has ever been the AD on a Golden Harvest movie. We are actually in the Golden Harvest studios as one of the several Bruce Lee lookalikes. And look at that insert there. People always laugh about these shots in the dressing room with the kind of the dummy or the cutout scene in the mirror. But I have to tell you, I'm not a huge fan of CGI, and I've seen CGI effects in some very recent films where they didn't look much better than these stick-ons. But having said that, I mean, the producers realized it didn't work because these shots are only used in the opening sequence, and then subsequently they only used clips of Bruce taken from his other films or shots of doubles. And there were three main doubles on the film, doubling Bruce Lee all the time, apart from at the end when we see Bruce Lee in a yellow tracksuit. Every other time you see Bruce Lee or the Billy Lowe character fighting, it's actually somebody else. The main fighting double is a guy called Tang Long or Kim Tai-jung, who is a Korean, and he did most of the fighting in this film and then went on to star in a movie in his own right, which was Tower of Death, the sequel of Game of Death. Look at that, that's the shot everybody always comments on. And evidently they'd realized it didn't work, so they just used it the one time, and that's it. So you had Tang Long, Kim Tai-jung. For the very acrobatic moves, Yun Bu, who is a familiar name, I think, to Kung Fu film fans from movies like Dreadnought and Prodigal Son and Knockabout. And this time was acting in movies, but also was working with Sammo Hung as a stuntman. So he doubled for Bruce. And you have shots of Bruce himself. And also, for some of the acting scenes, they used a businessman, a Hong Kong-based businessman, a Chinese businessman, who bore an uncanny resemblance to Bruce Lee. He wasn't an actor, just got this chance to come in and make some money off his uncanny resemblance, or supposedly uncanny resemblance, to the late, great Little Dragon. Here's Colleen Camp, our leading lady, singing a song also composed by John Barry. And if you want to play Hollywood Squares with Colleen Camp, she's had a very interesting career. She made her debut on the Dean Martin show. And, of course, you know, if we're playing 6 Degrees from Kevin Bacon, Lee worked with Dean Martin on the Wrecking Crew. Lee was a choreographer on the Wrecking Crew for Dean Martin. And oddly enough, make of this what you will, the film that Colleen Camp made before Game of Death was called Death Game. And then in 1982, a couple of years later, she made a film called Deadly Games. So if having death in the title is bad for your career, she certainly goes against that prediction, because she's had probably the most successful career of anybody who appears in Game of Death. She played a playmate in Apocalypse Now and has extended scenes in the Redux version. And she's married now to a Hollywood studio chief. And she appeared in big movies like Wayne's World and Last Action Hero and Die Hard with a Vengeance. So she's done really well. Here we are at the bad guy's lair, which is, the exterior is still there. It's the Red Pepper restaurant in Causeway Bay, which serves Szechuan cuisine. This is, the exterior is shot there, but this interior, palatial interior, and this little reference to the James Bond film From Russia with Love. This was all shot on the stages at Golden Harvest. And here's our main villain, Dean Jagger, as Dr. Land. And he's like a friendly old uncle type. He must be the most unlikely bad guy. Another Hollywood Squares connection, he played the grandfather, the antagonistic grandfather of Kwai Chang Caine on the old Kung Fu TV series. And fans of Bruce Lee will know that that series was originally developed under the title The Warrior, with Bruce Lee tipped to star as Kwai Chang Caine. And for whatever reason, that never happened, and David Carradine played the part. So that was one of the other films or martial arts themed programs that Dean Jagger was involved with. And here's the rest of his motley crew. We see to the foreground on the right Dan Inosanto, who had shot scenes for the original 1972 version of Game of Death. Had done a martial arts duel, a weapons duel with his real life instructor Bruce Lee, and he was the only person really involved in the 1972 version who came back to play a major role in this 78 version. This is Mel Novak here, who had been a stuntman and actor, a favorite of director Robert Klaus. He appears in most of Klaus's films, and he works still in the industry in character parts. He's a really dedicated born-again Christian, and he always has his scripts on the set that kind of got a binder around them saying, you know, like disciple of God or warrior for God or some such. So it kind of plays against his character here because he's a thoroughly reprehensible hitman, but in real life a very gentle Christian soul. And in a few moments we get a shot of what's meant to be Kareem Abdul-Jabbar, because probably the most outrageous of the fight sequences shot for Game of Death is the fight between the diminutive Bruce Lee and the towering Kareem Abdul-Jabbar. Jabbar was invited to come back had shot the duel in 1972, and he was invited to come back and shoot in 1978. And by this time, I think he felt that it was probably an exploitation of Bruce Lee's name to come back and shoot the film with a totally new script and new cast, and without the real Bruce Lee around. So he declined to come. So we have, like, in a few moments, you actually see this probably a black guy of regular dimensions from Chungking Mansions in Chim Sa Choi, who's been hired and then shot with this angle to make him seem to be as tall as Kareem Abdul-Jabbar. And you'll either buy into it or not. And a few moments ago, we saw the poster for this forthcoming fight that Carl Miller, played by Bob Wall, is going to have. And Bob Wall, of course, had worked with Bruce Lee in Way of the Dragon and Enter the Dragon, and was more than willing to come back to participate in Game of Death. And his opponent for the match is played by Sammo Hung, who many of you know, I guess, from the TV series Martial Law, but of course, prior to that, had a long and illustrious career as an actor, choreographer, director, producer in Hong Kong. And, many of his best films have been released or are being released by Hong Kong legends, including Magnificent Butcher and Eastern Condors. And this was his first chance to work on a really international film, by which I mean a film shot in English, that was going to be distributed internationally. And I asked him, what he remembered, and he says it was a while ago, but he remembered that when Robert Clouse was shooting a lot of the action scenes, Sammo said, this isn't the way to do it. And after Robert Clouse had finished his cut of the film, Sammo was allowed to come back and reshoot the action sequences to his standard. And some of the fights still look really good today. And I think Sammo, in terms of on-screen choreography, really was the successor to Bruce Lee, and proves it with some of the sequences he put together in this film. But that was why he got co-director credit on The Asian Prince. Obviously, contractually, Robert Clouse had to get sole credit internationally. And this was, in the original Game of Death, Bruce had chosen as an outfit for himself a yellow tracksuit with a black stripe, which has become probably the most famous outfit that Bruce Lee ever wore. And in the 78 version, to try to find a way to justify that, they've created this band of motorcycle gangsters who work for Steiner, and they all wear these motorcycle catsuits. You would think if you were engaged in criminal activity, you would want to seem as low-key as possible, and a bunch of guys in primary colored jumpsuits don't really, blend in that well. But that is going to explain later in the film why Bruce is wearing this oddly colored yellow form-fitting outfit. And maybe, like me, some of you other Bruce Lee fans actually invested in one of these outfits in your younger days, and no one ever could make that look cool apart from Bruce. There's Yuen Biao there, doing a quick bit of action. That spinning kick a few moments ago was Yuen Biao. The main fight here executed by Tang Long. And this fight scene was shot in the Chim Sa Choi area of Hong Kong, and it's next to the Kowloon Post Office and behind the Mariners Club. Mariners Club is the big building that you see in a few shots, and it's basically a cheap hotel and recreation facility that was built for sailors, for anybody working at sea. Hence the name, the Mariners Club. Has a very nice pool out the back, and there you're seeing the back of the building. It's a very distinctive blue colour building. And this is actually one of the few locations where Bruce shot. The car park is pretty much as it was when this pseudo Bruce movie was shot there. And people always keep walking by and going, wait a minute. And if they're big fans of Bruce Lee films, then they remember this location. And I certainly think that in this film, they've kind of brought Lee's fighting skill down to a realistic level, but certainly not akin to any character he ever played in his own films, because I think in Bruce Lee's own movies, he would have made short work of these attackers and Hugh O'Brian as well. Hugh O'Brian, an interesting actor, had a long career as a Western actor. I mean, don't mean in Western movies, but like in cowboy movies, and also played Arnold Schwarzenegger's father, or one of his fathers, in the movie Twins. This is actually an actual location. It's not the backlot. And the late Gig Young His real name was Byron Ellsworth Barr. And I think if my name was Byron Ellsworth Barr, I'd call myself Gig Young as well. And he had been a prolific and successful supporting actor in Hollywood and worked with many, screen greats. He won an Oscar for Best Supporting Actor for his role in They Shoot Horses, Don't They? And he, at the time signed to make Game of Death, was on the downhill slide and the tail end of his career. He met his wife, a young German actress named Kim Schmidt, while he was filming Game of Death in Hong Kong. This was like his last wife. He'd been married several times before. Here's a sequence shot for the 1972 version. James Chen Jun, a regular in the Bruce Lee movies and many other Golden Harvest films, fighting Kareem Abdul-Jabbar. And it was fascinating for me when I actually unearthed the original 1972 footage to see how this worked. That Bruce and another guy, the Bruce is still fighting on the floor below, and James Chen has run up to fight Kareem Abdul-Jabbar single-handed. Jabbar picks him up. This is actually coming into a wire shot, as you see James Chen pulled up. I saw all the outtakes of Chen floating around. And we go from here to a trampoline shot. Here's trampoline, off the trampoline, and down, and boom. And that's actually, in the original version, the end of the fight. Chen just gets up and screams for mercy, and Bruce comes up too late to save him. But I had to wait like 20 years or so to find that out. But it was worth it. So anyway, back to Gig Young. He met his wife-to-be when he was shooting Game of Death. And tragically, some years after that, he shot her and then committed suicide. So this was like within a year filming this movie. So he had a tragic end to his career. But he was, I think there's something about the tired quality of his character that plays to the role that he has in the film. And as I say, this is a good, bad movie. And I think it worked very well for international audiences because unlike some of the other Bruce Lee films, which were in Chinese with all Chinese actors, which structurally, in terms of the storytelling, were very different to international films. Those films, sometimes people find them hard going. I mean, they like the specific action scenes that Bruce shot, but the films as a whole, to ask audiences who are not fans of martial arts pictures to sit and watch the whole film was difficult. And when you see Game of Death, you've got actors, the structure is very much that of a Western film. You've got actors that you vaguely recognize speaking English. So I can easily see why the film worked as well as it did. I mean, it did very successfully internationally. And in Japan, it did extraordinarily well. This is a great Austin Powers moment. You've got these guys lounging around in their fetching spray-on outfits. And one of them is meant to follow them secretly. So he's sneaking forward with his motorbike in a green outfit. Now, this sequence is interesting. It leads into another challenge of Billy Lowe. And in the Asian print, they decided the fight sequence that follows this scene, a fight sequence set in a theater, wasn't strong enough for the Asian market, because the Asian market obviously see a lot of martial arts pictures, and at that time their standards were probably higher in terms of hand-to-hand combat than international audiences were. So after the film had wrapped, Sammo went back and shot a sequence in a greenhouse in which the Bruce Lee doubles, Tang Long and Yun Bu, fight Casanova Wong Kasafa, who was a Korean martial artist that Sammo worked with on several films, most memorably Warriors 2. And they shot this scene. This scene's actually seen in the Asian prints of Game of Death and in the international prints of the film Tower of Death, Game of Death 2. Here's the theater. The poster on the corner on the right there was for Shaolin Plot, starring Sammo Hung and Chen Xing. So even though this is depicted as being an opera, a theater where an opera show is about to happen, it's actually a movie theater. One of the theaters actually owned by Golden Harvest. And once we get inside, we're back on the back lot in the actual changing rooms at Golden Harvest for this sequence, which is not seen in the Asian prints of the film, where Bruce goes to meet his uncle, played by Roy Chow. And Roy Chow, a familiar face in international films and in Hong Kong movies. He's the monk that Bruce confers with at the beginning of Enter the Dragon, and also appeared in Indiana Jones and the Temple of Doom. And sadly, he passed away a few years ago. He had a wonderful speaking voice. I mean, he spoke wonderful English and had a very deep baritone. We don't get to hear it in this print because it's dubbed by a voiceover artist in LA. And deservedly, in the last couple of years before he died, he won every acting award known to that you can win in Asia for his performance in the film Summer Snow, which was directed by Anne Hoy, in which he played a man afflicted with Alzheimer's. And it was well timed because it was a justified reward at the end of a long and illustrious career. He was in films like Touch of Zen and the early King Hu martial arts action films. There's one of the clear shots we see of the face double for Bruce, this anonymous businessman, who I guess, having starred in this movie and been seen by millions of people, and went back to whatever kind of trading he was doing before. Most shots, as we progress in the film, he's wearing a beard, he's wearing different disguises, so they use Tang Long. But in the early part of the film, the film was shot pretty much in sequence. So in the earlier sequences of the film, they do use this guy who's not really that much of an actor, but with the dark glasses and the hairstyle, at least, pays a passing resemblance to Bruce. And the director, Robert Klaus, actually wrote the script for the 1978 Game of Death under the pseudonym Jan Spears. And this sequence is kind of a reference to Bruce Lee's real life because his father had been a performer in the opera. And here we have an uncle playing the same role, and it's the father figure to whom Bruce turns for advice at this stage. So it's obvious Klaus had done some research into Bruce Lee's biography and incorporated some biographical elements into the script. Now, this fight sequence here with the guys in the multicolored tracksuits, the guy in the yellow tracksuit is Fung Ha-on, who's a veteran of martial arts, Hong Kong martial arts pictures, and normally playing bad guy roles. And his father was a famous actor before him, and his sister Fung Bo-bo also was a star in the old black and white martial arts pictures, and now is an acclaimed character actress. Here's Dan Inosanto, as I mentioned earlier, a genuine student of the real Bruce Lee, and the man who carried the flag for many years for Jeet Kune Do, the non-style or system that Bruce Lee devised. And recently there's been a lot of controversy about who actually carries the flame. But I think within the martial arts world and the community at large, there's no doubt in anybody's mind that Dan Inosanto was the guy. And partly what cements that is the impression he made in his incredible martial arts duel with Bruce Lee that we see later in the film. Hugh O'Brian. I like Hugh O'Brian's performance in this movie. He really doesn't play it too over the top, but he's got a nice menace. And as I say, it's a good, bad movie. So you want to see bad acting in a good movie and good acting in a bad movie, and he delivers. He was a star of the Wide Earp TV series. Apparently, when they were shooting Game of Death, he used to break into scenes from The Music Man to liven up the set. He'd had quite a background in musical theatre. Bob Wall, another black belt in Chuck Norris's karate system and a champion in his own right. And he'd known Bruce Lee during the same era that Chuck Norris had met Bruce. And that's why Bob got to work with Bruce more than anybody in Way of the Dragon and Enter the Dragon. The phone box you see just then is a fake. They actually don't have and have never had phone boxes shaped like that in Hong Kong, but it makes for a better shot. But that's actually cobbled together on the backlot of Golden Harvest, and you see it later in the film. And it was there for a long time. It was always the phone box that you saw in Golden Harvest films. And the cutaways there to Colleen Camp. She's in the hotel room. And this is actually pretty much the same today. The Star Ferry Terminal in Kowloon. Star Ferry, one of the cheapest and most scenic rides you can have. And a moment now we see another one of the low-profile henchmen. There you go. Full-length yellow catsuit. Look at that kid. He's going, what's this guy on? Radioing for help. And here we are on the Star Ferry. And this is the same boats are running to this day. And they're running in the days of Bruce Lee. And anybody who goes to Hong Kong, I'm sure is familiar. That was for many years the only way to get from Hong Kong side to, from Kowloon side to Hong Kong side and back. The guy spying on them over the newspaper, you just saw a shot of him looking at Colleen Camp as she comes onto the boat, is played by Peter. That guy is Peter Chan-Long, who's one of Bruce Lee's stunt team. You can see him in all the Bruce Lee movies, and he's actually visible. There was some stills, at least some stills, and probably some footage shot up in the New Territories of Bruce Lee with some stuntmen, and some scenes in which the different martial arts masters, which were going to be seen in Game of Death, show off their skills. And Peter Chan Long was one of the guys who was involved with that. So he's somebody else who was involved with the original 1972 Game of Death, who got to come back and work on this movie. And he was helped out with the stunt arranging, and also plays his role as one of Steiner's henchmen. For those, I'm sure many people already know, but the backstory, the real Game of Death, was meant to feature Bruce as a character who goes to this island where guns are not allowed, and along with 4 other accomplices, he has to fight his way up a tower, and on each level of the tower there's the master of a different martial arts style, and as they fight their way up, the 4 other assistants to Bruce, or the fellow challengers, are systematically knocked down, defeated by the martial arts master, until Bruce Lee alone survives to fight the guy on the highest level, who is played by Kareem Abdul-Jabbar. And that was the concept that Bruce had in 72. But by the time they wanted to kind of finish the film in 78, that idea had been ripped off by so many Hong Kong-based filmmakers making movies with Bruce Lai and Bruce Le. They'd put all these fake Bruces into yellow tracksuits and had them fighting their way up towers. So Golden Harvest decided there was no way they could go ahead with that story. And so they decided to come up with something original that would incorporate the footage Bruce had left behind, and maybe to bring in aspects of Bruce's real life and indeed his death, which leads us into this sequence, which many fans at the time of the film's release in 78 felt was in bad taste. Subsequently, of course, it's been given far more attention and far more sad overtones by the fact that the sequence we're about to see on film was actually enacted in reality in the tragic death of Brandon Lee, the son of Bruce. In the sequence we're going to see now, Bruce's character is shot by a hitman who's positioned among a crowd of extras who are meant to be firing blanks, and of course the hitman's firing real bullets. And subsequently, we see footage of supposedly a faked funeral of the Bruce Lee character, and we see real footage of Bruce Lee's actual funeral, and the real Bruce Lee lying in the casket, which I think upset people rightly at the time. In 1978, it was a misjudgment, and I think it lacked taste to show the dead body of Bruce in the film. And then years later, on the set of The Crow, Brandon Lee was shot and killed by a projectile of some kind that was fired by a gun that was meant to be firing blanks. And this, of course, led to a lot of speculation about the curse of the Lee family. And I don't make past comment on that, but certainly now when you see this scene, I think it certainly has a different poignance to it, even in a hokey movie like this, because it has this association with this tragic event that happened years afterwards. Here we are intercutting between this footage from 1978 and this scene in 1971's Fist of Fury. This is the finale of Fist of Fury, aka The Chinese Connection, and the real Bruce Lee coming out. And they're recreating it with these 1978 extras, including Mel Novak, pulling the trigger. Everybody's firing blanks except for him. And he's obviously got very good aim with a handgun as he shoots the Bruce Lee character for real. He sustains a head wound. Here we are in the main studio at Golden Harvest, and we see in a moment Mel Novak going out into the back lot. That side exit is seen in so many films. Leads out to where Jackie Chan's office used to be. Sadly, of course, the Golden Harvest offices studio is no longer there. There's a big... there's Russell Cawthorne playing a doctor in the movie. Russell Cawthorne was, like, for a long time the Western face, the only Western guy at Golden Harvest, and now has his own company in Melbourne, Australia. But he appeared in several films and was involved with shooting a making of Game of Death, a behind-the-scenes feature, and doing all the promotional activities associated with the film. He's actually an Australian, and this was his claim to fame, playing one of the doctors. Now we have a different doctor for some reason coming in. This guy's called Jim James, and if you were eagle-eyed during a screening of Way of the Dragon, you can see that he's one of the guys, one of the customers who come into the restaurant and almost get kicked out by Bruce after the big fight scene in Way of the Dragon. And he is or was a Hong Kong-based businessman. I've never met him, and I think he may have left town. And he came back. He's obviously somebody who liked to be in movies. In '78, he got a bigger part here as the doctor who advises Bruce Lee in this film. But he was in quite a number of other movies as well. And you always have at any time in Hong Kong a list of people, either actors or martial arts people or businessmen, who, for whatever reason, think it's fun to be in films in their spare time and make a bit of extra money and go on movie sets and experience being in movies, and then maybe later go to the cinema with their friends and see themselves on the big screen. And you haven't got to be a member of any union. You normally don't even have to remember any lines. You just have to be prepared to show up and hang around for hours on end. And so once you've seen as many Hong Kong movies as I have, they become kind of familiar, because it's really quite a small talent pool, if talent is the right word. Here's some mocked-up covers. There's the winners there in the background on the cover of one of those magazines, the guys in the striped shirts. That was the band that gave the world Alan Tam and Kenny B. This is the real footage from the funeral of Bruce Lee, the Kowloon funeral home. And they intercut here between this real newsreel shots, and these are actually people turning up for the funeral of the real Bruce Lee. There's the Chinese calligraphy. A star sinks in a sea of his art, and Bruce's ornate coffin being brought in. And what were they thinking? And I guess this footage was available. They were also editing the documentary Bruce Lee, the Legend, and looking at all the available footage of Bruce. And it's in one sense, I suppose, it gives a certain reality to this sequence. But it would have been quite easy to mock something up, and I think most of the fans, and certainly the Lee family, would prefer they would have done that rather than to show the real Bruce Lee and the genuine grief of the mourners who came in 1973 to pay their respects to Hong Kong's favourite son, who died far too soon, but went on to become such a legend that even today, in this new century, I've been asked to sit here and talk about this movie in which he appears for a very small amount of time. And you notice the colour white in the background. White is actually the Chinese colour of death, which is why Chinese brides would never wear a white dress. They would normally wear a red dress, because red's like an auspicious colour. So you wonder what they think of the Western brides wearing white. And from this middle sequence of the film really moves away completely, not only from anything that Bruce Lee had in mind for Game of Death, but also from Hong Kong-style martial arts movie making, and becomes more of a mainstream thriller until we come back in for the finale sequence, which is a very rough edit of the fight sequences that Bruce Lee had shot for the 1972 Game of Death. And when we get to that, I'll talk a bit more about what was left in and what was cut out. And there was talk, given there was such a lot of downtime between Bruce's passing and the decision to complete Game of Death, as to whether the footage would ever be released. And I have to say, when I sat and watched all that was in the can, I realized the problem that they'd had, because you were faced with the ending of a film. The star had passed away. One of the major players of the 1972 version, an actor called Get Yun, had also passed away. And people had got older. The storyline had been ripped off left, right, and centre. So you were left with footage that really didn't present itself in any obvious way as something you could edit into a film. And so Raymond Chow turned to Robert Clouse and said, see what you can do with this. So Robert Clouse looked at the footage and really didn't like any of it, and had made a decision and very openly told Madalena Chan, who was the production manager on this film, that he was going to use as little of it as possible, which is why we really only get to see the Game of Death footage at the very end of the film. And all the rest of it, as much as possible, is a new film devised, scripted, and directed in the main by Robert Clouse. And they had Golden Harvest attempted to bring in friends and co-workers of Bruce, students of Bruce, like James Coburn and Steve McQueen, people like Pele, who were fans of Bruce Lee, Chuck Norris, who had worked with him on Way of the Dragon. And there really wasn't a huge amount of interest. I mean, they weren't paying a lot of money. And I think there was a general feeling among the friends, fans, and students of Bruce that this was something of an exploitation film, something akin to Plan 9 from Outer Space, though I have to say it turned out a lot better than that. And so they didn't want to be involved, and we ended up with Gig Young and Hugh O'Brien and Dean Jagger and Colleen Camp and the other Hollywood B players who Klaus brought in to work on this movie. Robert Klaus, just a little side note, was actually, it's passed away a few years ago, but was actually deaf. And most of the time wasn't really, he had his first ADs and people listening to what the dialogue was, but he really wasn't too concerned about the dialogue in his films, which in the case of some of his films is painfully evident. But he certainly had an interesting visual eye. I mean, there was one good movie, apart from Enter the Dragon, that he made called Darker Than Amber, which starred my Australian countryman Rod Taylor and that great bad guy William Smith. William Smith actually was one of the first choices to be the Roper character in Enter the Dragon, but he was so much taller than Bruce that they decided that wasn't going to work, and they hired John Saxon instead. But Robert Klaus obviously went on to direct all different kind of movies like Black Belt Jones, which tried to make Jim Kelly a star, the China O'Brien films, but I think Darker Than Amber, of the films that he did apart from those, is the best regarded critically. Certainly deserves some kind of DVD reissue. And this is actually a real clinic on Hong Kong Island, and it's normally not too difficult. Peter Chan Lung again. It's not too difficult to get into these places. Most businesses in Hong Kong, if you go in and you just want to do something, they'll quote you a price, and if you can pay, then you can come in and shoot. They really do make you pay an arm and a leg. It's very expensive, but certainly, because the sound stages in Hong Kong are so limited, you constantly have to go out and find real locations on which to shoot. And a couple of points I didn't get in earlier. I want to mention that if you go back to the sequence where we first see Kareem Abdul-Jabbar fighting with James Tien, when Gig Young intros the scene, he mentions the fact that the character played by James Tien, at least in the 1978 version, is called Charlie Wang. And I think this is a reference to Charles Wang, who is the chief of Salon Films, who rent out the Panavision license for Asia and have supplied camera equipment to virtually every major production between Sand Pebbles which was the old Steve McQueen movie, and the most recent one probably is Rush Hour 2 with Jackie Chan at the time of speaking. And so this was like a little joke on Charles Wang. And then another scene in the movie, just before the fight in the theater, you hear Hugh O'Brien refer to one of the big-time gamblers they're dealing with as Andre. And I think this is a reference to Andre Morgan, who was an executive at Golden Harvest from the time of Enter the Dragon onwards, and one of the producers on this film, and now works in Hollywood and manages many stars, including Sammo Hung and Shannon Lee, and executive produced the martial law TV series and got Sammo hooked up with that show for CBS. So that was a little name check for him. And it's interesting to see Bruce, playing with these disguises, because in his real films he also had played with the idea of disguising himself, most prominently in Fist of Fury, where he puts on his disguise as this phone repair man and as an old man in one scene. So this is something also that Bruce had toyed with in the real films, and something that Klaus plays with here. Now, there's two different edits of Game of Death. And I think in the earlier edit, we get to see the fight between Bruce Lee, the real Bruce Lee, and the Korean Hapkido expert Chi Hon-soi, which in most prints is seen at the end of the film. We see it in the middle of the movie. I think the feeling was that all the real fights from 1972 had been bunched at the end of the picture, and there was, as I mentioned earlier, this long gap in the middle when it's really like an international, a Western thriller. There's nothing really to make it a Bruce Lee movie. So there's a sequence that was dropped in just after the scene we just saw with him on the motorbike, of him in various disguises as an old man in a beard, riding around Hong Kong and eventually finding the Red Pepper restaurant in Causeway Bay. Has a phone tip-off telling him where to look, and goes up and finds no one's there except for Chi Hon-soy. So they have a little dialogue exchange, which is not in the fight as it's edited in the 1978, the regular version of the film, and then a fight, and he leaves Chi Hon-soy on the floor, crippled or dying, or basically as a warning to Dr. Land to leave him alone, and then goes on to follow Dr. Land himself in this sequence to Macau. And so when we get to the end of the movie, there are only two fights. Bruce Lee versus Dan Inosanto and Bruce Lee versus Kareem Abdul-Jabbar. And something happened during the process of editing the different prints of the film. And for a long time, the master copy used in Asia, in Hong Kong, to strike prints, the sequence in the middle with the Chi Hon-soy fight had been cut. But they didn't bother to take that fight and put it back at the end. So the film only had two fights at the end. And so even the Universe DVD version, the different video and DVD versions brought out in Hong Kong over the last 10 years, only had two fights at the end of Game of Death. And because most people, both the distributors and even the audiences in Hong Kong, are not Bruce Lee fans, nobody noticed. And I think this is actually the first time, this DVD is the first time that somebody went back and restored, using the Hong Kong materials, restored the three fights to the end of the film. I think maybe Taiwan and another few territories, they actually released the other version with the Chi Hon-soy fight in the middle and the Jabbar and Dan Inosanto fights at the end. Another point to mention is that in the Asian print, the conversation between Billy Lowe and the black boat captain is actually slightly longer. I used to kid people that the black boat captain was longtime Bruce Lee fan Chris Alexis, but actually it's not. It's another guy. He's not a bad actor, actually, but he's just some guy that they picked up in Hong Kong, normally from the famous Chungking Mansions. That's where you go to recruit Western talent for Hong Kong action movies. And we're in Macau, the Portuguese enclave, which was ruled for many years by Portugal, just as Hong Kong was ruled for many years by Great Britain. And as you'll notice, it's a very different architecture to Hong Kong, very European. It was used for many of the exterior shots in the recent Wong Kar-wai film, In the Mood for Love. And Bruce Lee, of course, had filmed here for Fist of Fury. The famous scene with the park and the sign saying no dogs or Chinamen allowed was actually shot at the Bird Park in Macau. And the enclave was just returned to the mainland Chinese government by Portugal, and very successfully. I mean, just as Hong Kong was returned to the rule of mainland China, and no real change in the standard of living of the people of Macau. Macau is famous as somewhere where gambling is permitted. It's not permitted in Hong Kong. So there are many famous casinos in Macau. And action sequences from a number of gangster films have been shot there because obviously it tends to be where you have casinos, there you have gangsters. Here's a lion dance sequence, and I think this is actually the only one of the Bruce Lee movies that has a sequence showing this traditional art form. Lion dancing was a practice that was undertaken by martial artists from different schools, and at Chinese New Year they used to come out and compete to earn really quite sizable amounts of money, lucky money, because the lion was meant to bring prosperity to shopkeepers and homeowners and whoever's abode they danced outside of was meant to have good fortune in the year to come. So it was like a Chinese New Year ritual. And now, because it was so lucrative, these days you get lion dance teams where they don't really practice martial arts as such. They only practice lion dance to perform lion dance shows because you make so much money from doing those kind of demonstrations. So many of the people are not martial artists. But for this sequence, and seeing as we're shooting in 78, all these extras, all these guys are from local Macau-based martial arts schools who are brought in to enliven this sequence. Robert Klaus making good use, really, of the European-style villas. Guy on the left closing the door is Mars, Sing, regular Jackie Chan stuntman, co-star with Jackie Chan in the film Dragon Lord, and the star of the film Lackey and the Lady Tiger. We see him a bit later in a fight sequence that's coming up. He was one of the assistant fight choreographers on this film and still very active in the industry. And this scene coming up, it's interesting to watch it in the Chinese version because it makes no sense whatsoever. Because the play is all about the fact that the two visitors are speaking in Mandarin, or at least in a Chinese dialect that Dr. Land doesn't understand. And in the Chinese version, everybody's speaking Chinese, so it doesn't work at all. And this is these two familiar character actors for anybody who's seen a bunch of Hong Kong movies, and this backdrop, the house, has also been seen in many Asian films, and is also used in the James Bond movie, The Man with the Golden Gun. You can see the house in one sequence, and the disguised Billy Lowe sneaking onto the premises, and played for most of this sequence by Tang Long. Tang Long has another claim to fame. After playing the Bruce Lee character in Game of Death 2, Tower of Death, went back to Korea and appeared in many local martial arts action pictures, but was brought back as Bruce Lee, or as the ghost of Bruce Lee, for No Retreat, No Surrender, the film that gave the world Jean-Claude Van Damme. And in that movie, there's a young martial artist, an underdog martial artist, who goes to the grave of Bruce Lee in Seattle to beg for instruction, and finds himself meeting the ghost of Bruce Lee. And this character was played by Kim Tai-chung, a.k.a. Tang Long. And he's still around, still living in Korea. I don't think he's involved with film anymore, doing other kinds of business. But this is a beautiful villa in typical of the colonial era, the Portuguese era of Macau. And you notice when Tang Long comes in and he's meant to be getting to grips with poor old Dean Jagger, he puts him down on the ground ever so carefully. Look, he's watching the. Just don't hurt him. He's an old guy. Quite right too. How they could have picked him to be the bad guy is anybody's guess. And here comes an interesting lineup of stuntmen, including Lau Ga-wing and Forsing, or Mars, and all of them familiar faces to fans of the genre. Lau Ga-wing is the brother of Lau Gala, and there he is in the middle, just holding his face there in the shirt and tie, and worked with Sammo Hung a lot during this period, and is a terrific martial arts actor in his own right, and one of the mainstays at Golden Harvest. And this sequence, there's Lau Ga-wing coming in, getting kicked there, and another one of these guys is Chern Kun. That's the guy being trodden on just then. And Chern Kun was actually a leading light at Cinema City. There's Mars going back into the water. And these are all the Sammo's regular workers, the guys who could take a hit. And I remember seeing this sequence and not being too sure at the time whether this was the real Bruce Lee or not, because the skill level was quite impressive, particularly at that time when I really hadn't seen too many Hong Kong martial arts pictures. But it's one of the scenes shot by Sammo Hung where he really captures the style. Look here, he's so smart. Bob Wall comes in. We don't see Bob Wall's technique, but we see the other guy, because I guess Bob Wall's technique, Sammo didn't think the technique was up to snuff, so he uses the camera to disguise that. So we get the impression that Bob Wall has thrown something at Tang Long, and then we see Tang Long's kicks because they're obviously much crisper than whatever Bob was showing. Though I have to say, I never thought that Bob Wall was a terrific on-screen fighter as such, but in the later sequence, the one Sammo choreographed for him in the kickboxing ring, he really looks as good as he ever has, and better than he has in any other film, including the movies he made with Bruce Lee. The tinted windows there is something that we see in a number of houses of this period, and obviously a very European influence, because when people got posted overseas for long amounts of time, whether it was in Hong Kong or Macau or Shanghai, they became homesick, and so they would really construct as much as possible of their own culture around them. There's the famous ruined church in the background, St. Stephen's, was destroyed. That's all that remains of the church is the frontispiece. Behind that, there's nothing at all. It was destroyed by a fire like centuries ago. No one can ever remember there actually being a St. Stephen's church. All they can remember is the frontispiece, which is probably the most famous landmark in Macau. And if you ever go to Macau, I'm sure you'll go and have your photograph taken by the frontispiece of St. Stephen's, because everybody seems to. And quick use of the firecrackers there for Billy Lowe to make his getaway. And Bob Wall, still on the scene as a businessman. He's not really involved with films anymore. You can see him in a bunch of episodes of Walker, Texas Ranger. Chuck Norris obviously hired him to work on that show. Here we are. This was actually constructed at Golden Harvest. They couldn't get the necessary clearances to shoot this sequence in an actual sports arena, so they built the arena on the Golden Harvest backlot. And I think it's actually the biggest single standing set, or as big as any single standing set they ever had at Golden Harvest. You wonder what the weight category was for Bob Wall to be fighting Sammo Hung. This was middleweight? Sammo's looking great. His movements are great. I mean, always people say, geez, for a heavy-set fellow, he can really flip and fly. And he did a good job here because, of course, not only is he engaging in the fist fight with Bob Wall, but he also choreographed the scene. And if you watch at ringside, doing a couple of shots, you can see a bald-headed, bearded guy with a camera, and that's John Ladowski. And John Ladowski has mentioned in several interviews that he plays the ring photographer in the film, and he is indeed, as an extra, he is in a couple of shots, but you really have to watch the ringside carefully to see him. The reason that you only see him in a few shots is, according to Madalena Chan, who was the production manager, he was bringing in these tours of Japanese tourists to visit the set of Bruce Lee's Game of Death. And when she realized they were getting he was basically selling tickets to these people, then they asked him not to come back anymore. So he only got to do a little cameo at ringside. But he did become friends with Dan Inosanto and studied under Dan. And then Dan Inosanto was invited to come back to shoot another film called The Chinese Stuntman, which starred one of the Bruce Lee lookalikes, Ho Jung-to, Bruce Lai. And it's not a bad film. And Dan gets to show off some of his Filipino weapons skills in that movie. And John Ladowski played one of the main bad guys. So they got to fight and to work together in the film. So you get to see some of John Ladowski, pretty good sticks guy. And you get to see some of his stuff in The Chinese Stuntman. But in this movie, it's blink and you'll miss him. And this is actually the editing of this little sequence is not too bad. There's the Bruce Lee character wearing the same disguise that the real Bruce Lee wore in the film Fist of Fury. And Klaus using this cutting to build up the tension as we think Colin Camp might use a gun to take out, I guess, all three of the men responsible for Billy Lowe's death. And if you watch the film too many times as I have, you do notice that a lot of the extras in the background are really not enjoying themselves. They're just sitting there like, when do we get to go home? It's hard work to be an extra in Hong Kong movies. People turn up and they think, oh, this is going to be fun. And after a couple of hours, that's it. They want to leave. And Sammo says, when he was working with Bob Wall, he really had to kind of unteach some of the movements to Bob, because Bob was a genuine champion in sport karate, and had certain habits that he'd picked up from doing real tournament fights. And, of course, for film, it's very different to the way that you choreograph stuff. But I think this scene and the scene that's coming up, a fight sequence in the locker room, really shows Sammo using the limited resources available. You haven't got a real Bruce Lee, and you've been asked to make a Bruce Lee movie, and doing his normal exemplary job. And as I'm sure all of the diehard Bruce Lee fans are aware, Sammo's the first opponent that Bruce Lee fights in Enter the Dragon. And that scene was actually shot after the movie as a whole had been finished. And Bruce felt that the film didn't open with enough of a punch. So he asked Sammo to come back from Korea, where Sammo was shooting another movie. And they went out to film this, the opening duel. And this was like the second Bruce Lee movie that Sammo worked on. But he had been earmarked to cooperate with Bruce Lee on Game of Death. And had Bruce Lee lived, he definitely would have been in the original version of Game of Death. So he didn't get to do that, but he got to be a main player in the 1978 edit that we're watching now. So it's choreographed. Bob Wall wins the day, and Carl Miller is champion. And you see some of those guys are not really saying a huge amount as they're sitting giving their ringside commentary. And again, still in the Golden Harvest backlot. I mean, they really went to town with this. I mean, it has the size and scale of a genuine sports stadium. I don't think that kickboxing has ever been that popular in Hong Kong that you would have this kind of audience for that kind of event. and now going down. This is a rear corridor at Golden Harvest. You look at Bob avoiding getting a TKO from the lights, and in he goes into the dressing room, bashing his head in the process. That's probably the most dangerous stunt that Bob had to do in the whole film, was actually navigating that corridor. And he had high hopes, I think, of having a film career of his own, but he went back to America. And Bob Wall was in the film Black Belt Jones, which was created as a vehicle for Jim Kelly, who had co-starred with Bruce Lee in Enter the Dragon, and he has a supporting role there. And subsequent to that, he made his fortune in property in LA and did not really pursue a movie career with any kind of consistency. And at any given time in Hong Kong, there's always one attractive blonde model who's working in TV and print ad campaigns, and there she is. Obviously, in 1978, it was her, and so she got cast in the thankless role of Carl Miller's girlfriend, and so to the winner the spoils. So whenever they were looking for a blonde babe for these movies, there was always one girl in Hong Kong working at the modeling agencies who was all over the place. And you see throughout the 70s and 80s, blonde babe, American blonde babe, and that would be, the belle de jour used in that way in Hong Kong films. And now setting up, this is actually a neat little fight, and I really admire the way Sammo uses the elements. He set it up here with it's not really much of an arena, a changing room. Pulls off the disguise, and there's a shot. Looks Billy Lowe, and there's a shot from Way of the Dragon, and he comes forward, and then sets it up nicely. Again, the Way of the Dragon shot, but the use of power powder, or what they call pow fan, is another thing that Sammo really brought into the fight choreography business, and it's used to good effect here, and uses these high angle to kind of get away from the fact that it's not the real Bruce Lee, and also to emphasize the motions. And then he cuts back and forth between Tang Long, and he shoots the kicks of Tang Long with fast edits so that they look even cleaner and crisper. And there's Yun Bu coming around, Yun Bu doing a spin kick. That guy in the foreground there runs an advertising agency or a marketing agency in Hong Kong now, still around. And then we go into there, that's Tang Long for the close-up, doing his best Bruce Lee impersonation. Comes in, and there's Yun Bu. When you get the more acrobatic movements, it's always Yun Bu. And then when you get the more taekwondo, straight, extended kicks, then it's Tang Long. There's Bruce getting hit in Way of the Dragon. He goes down, Tang Long looking up. This is playing back to the Colosseum scene from Way of the Dragon. And really good use of the power powder. You notice it's like a light coating of dust, like talcum powder. You put it on clothes or even someone's bare torso. And then when a blow connects, the dust comes up, and it adds power to the technique. And it's something that you can see in the early Sammo movies, and it's a technique he worked on. And there's nice use of kicks. This is really the best that Tang Long has ever looked. And in this film, the best that Bob Wall has ever looked. And now he comes forward. Boom, there's Yun Bu. Beautiful jump spinning, kicking down, that nice landing. You can see him rehearsing that on Bruce Lee the Legend. Tang Long back. And then when they get to grips, it's going to be Tang Long fighting with Bob Wall. That's a nice little insert there, typical Sammo thing. When he's trying to flex his muscles, it's Tang Long. Then when you go into the acrobatic bit, the flip, then it's Yun Bu. So he's pressing him forward. It's Tang Long feeling it. Yun Bu, so he gets a bit shorter there. Goes up, boom, under the chin. So you see Yun Bu's face as they come round. There's Tang Long again. And this, the Iron Monkey number, but a few years earlier with the hyped up kick, slow motion, and then the same way that Bob is killed in Enter the Dragon, as Bruce does the wind up before charging in with this killer sidekick. So this is really an object lesson, just this little fight sequence in the real Sammo Hung style of action filmmaking, and it was way ahead of its time in 1978, and it showed how he really had taken this dragon whips his tail, and redubbed as "You lose, Carl Miller." That little shot at the end there of Bruce from Way of the Dragon. But full power to Samo, because it's a neat little scene, and didn't need to be as good as that, because but I know Samo only works at one speed, which is full speed ahead. Then we look at the those distinctive shaped tatami screens behind Dean Jagger there, which will feature later in the film, because when Bruce had shot his 1972 footage, every level of the pagoda was illuminated by these square panels. It's not tatami, sorry, shoji panels, which is a traditional Asian, and the actual temple that Bruce Lee had set the film at actually stands in Korea and can be seen in a movie called The Mars Villa, which was recently re-released on DVD as Wu-Tang Magic Kick. And you see that there's a guy called John Liu, and he's training at this Korean temple. And that temple is actually the same temple that Bruce Lee had set the movie in. And if you look at the original drawings of Bruce, you can see this giant golden Buddha, and then the pagoda, the multi-level tower in which the action was going to take place. And I've been asked by many people what happens in the rest of the 1972 Game of Death, the Game of Death that Bruce Lee never lived to complete. And the reality is, as far as I can make out, nobody really knows. There are notes left behind by Bruce, script notes, which lay out in very broad terms what would have happened in the rest of the film. But there certainly wasn't a script in the Hollywood sense of a script with dialogue and scenes blocked out. There survives a few sequences detailing Bruce coming to Hong Kong en route to Korea, getting to Korea, and then the actual sequence for the finale, or the latter section of the film with the 5 challenges. That's laid out. Not only does he lay out in terms of who fights who and what style they practice, but he also lays out the number of feet of film that would be expended to shoot the specific scenes, which just shows the level of detail to which Bruce Lee brought to everything that he did. Because the amount of footage of film is something that producers ask about and accountants, and so it's not the kind of thing normally that movie stars and kung fu movie directors would concern themselves with. But that was the level to which Bruce focused on any project to hand. And so the notes really indicate that he'd expended a great deal of time and energy in working out the latter section of the film. And Andre Morgan, remembers Bruce saying, "It's a good thing we're doing Enter the Dragon, because it means I have this time to figure out what I'm going to do with the rest of Game of Death." And Madalena Chan, who was the line producer on this Game of Death, the 1978 version, was production manager on Enter the Dragon, and she followed Bruce Lee, the real Bruce Lee, around every day, making notes on Game of Death. But unfortunately, understandably, almost 20 years on, dear Madalena cannot remember exactly or anything that Bruce Lee told her. So the notes, where they lie now, is anybody's guess. This graveyard actually is the same graveyard that we see Bruce Lee in at the beginning of Enter the Dragon, when he goes to pay respects to his sister and his mother. And it's on Hong Kong Island. And when you drive from Central through to Tai Tam Road, which is where Enter the Dragon was shot, you will necessarily go past that graveyard on the way through to the tunnel that takes you through Hong Kong Island to Tai Tam. And this rather grisly scene being played out here with Hugh O'Brien smashing the fake Bruce. This plays to all the theories that were abounding in 1978, that Bruce Lee wasn't actually dead, that he'd actually faked his death to escape his enemies or to go into seclusion in China, and he was going to make a triumphant return. And in 1978, there were more of those rumors than there are now, because in 78, Bruce had only been dead for 5 years. So some of his more devout fans really did feel that they couldn't accept still that he had passed away. And this exterior here is actually an orphanage also on Hong Kong Island that still stands to this day, and just presents a kind of quite a nice moody backdrop for this encounter between Billy Lowe and Anne, played by Colleen Camp. And yeah, it's an orphanage, and just towards Causeway Bay, which is one of the bigger shopping and residential areas of Hong Kong Island. And we never see Bruce's. The implication is that Billy Lowe's received certain scarring, that his face has changed, and therefore he doesn't want the love of his life to see him. So he's making sure there's this gate between them. This isn't really explored in the film, but certainly his face is completely obscured during this sequence. And you wonder why he leaves, in the logic of this film, such as it is, why he actually leaves her at the mercy of Dr. Land and his henchmen, rather than taking her with him and putting her somewhere safe before he stages his assault on Dr. Land's mansion. But then I guess it's to add another level to the danger, and also to present another sequence for Robert Clouse to shoot, which is the big motorcycle action sequence in the warehouse. Obviously, Robert Clouse came onto the project and really wanted to make his mark, and rather than just to lace together the footage that Bruce Lee had left behind, to really shoot an entirely new film. And I mentioned earlier that this section of the film where we are now is really, there's no relevance to Bruce or anything that Bruce Lee had shot whatsoever. And it's just purely a contemporary action film that happens to feature a character who happens to look a bit like Bruce Lee. Though I have to say, back in the first run of this movie, when I saw it with friends who were not martial arts film fans or Bruce Lee fans, they found the film very accessible, more so than something like The Big Boss. Because really for The Big Boss, not a lot happens for a lot of the time. And the production values are fairly poor. And you look at this movie and it's like at least a decent quality American TV movie, so people feel familiar with it, and that technically it's well executed enough that they can relate to it. So I'm not surprised that it played so well overseas, and it was hugely successful in Japan. So much so that when the decision was taken to shoot a sequel, it was aimed primarily at the Japanese market. And Tower of Death, Game of Death 2, really bears no relation to this Game of Death, other than one of the main characters in the film is supposedly Billy Lowe, but there's no direct relation between the two films. And quite a few sequences for Tower of Death were shot in Japan to play to the Japanese market. And years later, when the original Game of Death footage was discovered in the archive, it was sold to a Japanese company for a huge amount of money, because they wanted to restore the Bruce Lee footage to its original state, re-edit it, present it as Bruce Lee intended. And they did do that, and they had actually a theatrical run in Japan with the film, which was hugely successful. And then it went on to video and DVD and did equally well. So there seems to be an insatiable demand in Japan for Bruce Lee product. And particularly there was a fascination for many, many years with Game of Death, probably because there was all this footage that nobody had seen. I was always concerned, and I am concerned now, that as and when all the real footage does surface, people might feel a little bit that it is anticlimactic, because though it is interesting, and I mean it does offer a different view of what Bruce Lee shot in 1972, at the same time, I mean, there are no other flaws. There were no other flaws filmed showing Bruce Lee in action other than Chi Hon-soy and Dan Inosanto and Kareem Abdul-Jabbar. So that is all that there is. And what's additional is the sequences shot within those scenes that are featuring James Tien and Gek Yun, and the dialogue sequences Bruce Lee shot, and some incidental action scenes that were cut for whatever reason when Robert Clouse re-edited the footage for the 1978 version. But there really aren't any great revelations apart from the end of the footage, and by now I'm not giving any secrets away. Bruce Lee never goes up to the final tower of the pagoda, and he's actually Jabbar's character is depicted as a blind man, which is a recurring theme in Bruce Lee's movies. It was an element of the Silent Flute script, his great unmade masterpiece, and it was actually, the idea was expressed in the original version of Game of Death. But I think when people do see the footage, they might feel it's not as is not what they had anticipated because it's been 20 years. In that time, everything's become embellished to the extent that it's like a lost masterpiece, and it's really just more of the same. There are some clips that remain undiscovered. The very beginning of the footage, in which we see Get Yun and James Tien come to challenge Dan Inosanto, that is lost. I mean, I think it's probably, along with a lot of Bruce Lee material, still in the Golden Harvest archive, but Golden Harvest no longer distribute the Bruce Lee movie, so they really don't have any reason to go digging around in their film archive to find it. But I think there probably is footage from Game of Death that still exists, and behind-the-scenes footage and all manner of other materials that, for whatever reason, have never seen the light of day. So I hope that the fans, when they actually see the Game of Death footage, will take it for what it is, and enjoy also the quick cuts that you see, the few moments captured on film of Bruce Lee actually working on the set, choreographing the scenes with Dan Inosanto and Kareem Abdul-Jabbar, because they offer another insight really into Bruce Lee's working practice, because we don't really have a huge amount of behind-the-scenes footage, because at the time that his movies were made in Hong Kong, you didn't really have making-ofs or Entertainment Tonight or, Access Hollywood and all these shows that take you behind the scenes. Sometimes I think take you too far behind the scenes, and the audiences really have seen and heard all the good stuff about the big action films before they even come into the theatres. But none of that existed back in the 70s, and there wasn't really any hard and fast policy about preserving footage. So most of the outtakes and never before seen clips and the the goofs and all the other stuff that you have from any movie, this material would have been burnt, or the film stock reused, or it would have been disposed of in some other way. So nobody, of course, knew at that time that Bruce Lee would not go on to make 20 other movies, and in which case his earlier Hong Kong films would perhaps be less relevant than they are now. And there we see the yellow tracksuit making its first appearance with Bruce, because he's going to take it off that biker and wear it. And obviously some thought went into justifying why on earth Bruce Lee is wearing a form-fitting yellow tracksuit with a black racing stripe. And among the people that Bruce had invited to work with him on Game of Death was, of course, George Lazenby, who's been interviewed a number of times and revealed what little he remembers about the discussions he had with Bruce about the film. And I remember when I talked to Lazenby, he was telling me that he had come to Hong Kong pretty much on a whim, because he'd heard that the industry here was really happening at that time, and was staying at the Grand Hyatt Hotel, and called up Golden Harvest because he heard that they were the hottest company in town. And at that moment, his Bond movie, On Her Majesty's Secret Service, was playing in Hong Kong theatres. So Raymond Chow was like, wow, here's the new James Bond's going to come to my office. So Lazenby admits he was broke at that time, so he got like a bus up to Hammer Hill Road, where the Golden Harvest offices are, and was picked up in a limo. And it was one limo contained Raymond Chow driving by himself, and there was another limo driving behind, and this was being driven by Bruce, and Linda Lee was in the front seat, and Bruce's secretary, maybe it was Madeleine Chan, was in the back, and next to Madeleine Chan was Bolo. And Bruce obviously wanted Lazenby in his car, so he says, oh no, it's okay, she'll sit on your lap. So his secretary sat on Lazenby's lap, and the car rolled off with Bruce at the wheel, Linda Lee in the passenger seat, and the back seat with Bolo and James Bond. And apparently there was a typhoon warning that day, so they got a police escort to a restaurant where they could be undercover in case the winds became dangerous. And you can imagine the look on the faces of the diners when in walks this lineup of Raymond Chow, who is the biggest producer in Hong Kong, Bruce Lee, the biggest star, George Lazenby, in theatres at that time as James Bond, and Bolo. And I think people stare at Bolo wherever he goes, and with good reason, because, I'm sure everybody remembers him from Enter the Dragon. He's like the huge executioner. And a few moments ago, we saw Colleen Camp running off into the rain. And that's actually the last that we see of her in this version of the film. That's her out of the movie. So there are different versions of the ending, and I'll go over that later. But that's actually her done and this long protracted sequence here with primarily Australian stunt bikers. Back in '78, really, vehicle stunt work was not at a very high standard in Hong Kong. So when Klaus devised this whole sequence, and I guess he wanted to do something a little different from the standard martial arts action, he had to bring in guys from Australia to do all these stunts in this warehouse. Subsequently, of course, Hong Kong, the vehicle guys like Bruce Law and the other Hong Kong vehicle stuntmen have proved themselves to be as good as anybody on the planet. But at that time, really, the whole industry was devoted towards martial arts movies, empty-handed combat films. I'm sure nobody's noticing the continuity in this film because it's not that kind of movie. But here you see the rain is obviously a major factor in the forthcoming showdown between Billy Lowe and the hitman Stick, played by Mel Novak. And then later in the movie, we see him climbing into the Red Pepper restaurant, and there's no rain. And then later, once he's inside the Red Pepper, when he's on the floor that's governed by Kareem Abdul-Jabbar, he smashes open some panels in the shoji screen on the wall, and we see broad daylight outside, and blue skies and sunshine. And then when he comes out of the building at the top, it's night again and no rain. So quite a night, like Melbourne, 4 seasons in one night. Mel Novak, actually not a martial artist as such, though he had done some boxing. So Sammo Hung had to be careful how he choreographed this scene with Tang Long unloading these kicks and punches. And Mel Novak could take a punch, though, because he'd been a stuntman, so his reaction is good. And so he just got to do a little bit of boxing and grappling, and then take a beating and at the hands of Tang Long, and gives over the doctor at the Red Pepper restaurant. Red Pepper restaurant turns up in this film and also can be seen in Frankie Chan's movie, Burning Ambition. It's like a key action sequence is shot in the Red Pepper restaurant. Not quite sure why it was chosen. I know that Golden Harvest do have various property holdings in Hong Kong. Maybe the Red Pepper was or is one of those, and so it was available as an exterior for them to shoot at. Certainly it's a nice looking building, and there was a Japanese tour of Hong Kong a couple of years ago. Japanese Bruce Lee fans came to visit Hong Kong, and one of the stop-offs on their tour was the Red Pepper restaurant, even though and here it is now, to our knowledge, Bruce Lee himself never went there, but it is such a prominent location in Game of Death, which is supposedly a Bruce Lee movie. When I went there, I noticed something that the exterior is pretty much as it is now. The interior, once we get inside the restaurant, is actually somewhere else. It's not actually the Red Pepper restaurant itself. Human fly. Sure, everybody remembers that line from Enter the Dragon with Jim Kelly sees Bruce Lee climbing, and then as he lands, the light goes on, which I guess is meant to signify that somebody knows he's there. And this is the interior of another restaurant altogether, not the Red Pepper, I guess because they needed the staircase to be situated in a certain place, and the stairs at the Red Pepper are actually located somewhere else. You need this exit sign here going into the staircase, and this is our fake Bruce Lee going up the stairs and seeing the weapons on the wall. In the real version, Bruce Lee comes up and he already has got the weapons from a lower floor because he and his guys have fought their way up. Here's Bruce, and this is actually, Dan is looking at Gek Yun and James Chen in this shot. This was edited together. I guess Robert Klaus had access to more footage than we now have access to. So he cut together the very opening of the scene when Dan gets up to execute this rhythm, to a challenging rhythm to Gek Yun and James Chen. And then this shot here with Bruce, it actually came about after Dan has defeated both Gek Yun and James Chen, and Bruce enters the fray. So those guys are standing to the left of where Bruce was and have been edited out from this version because Klaus didn't really want to deal with the fact there were two other guys in the pagoda, or in what's meant to be the upper levels of the Red Pepper restaurant. And if you believe that, you believe anything. And then There's a little dialogue there that was cut, and then Bruce Lee comes forward. Chris Kent, one of the, or what should we say, second generation students of Bruce. There's an insert shot there. Actually, Bruce has Get Yun bring over the nunchucks for him. Chris Kent, one of Bruce Dan Santos students, actually did the "Wah!" for this, did the Bruce Lee war cries. And Dan actually came back and dubbed his own voice. And there's various, like at the end of this sequence, Bruce Lee goes surprised, and they cut that out, all the dialogue sequences, except for a very quick one line from Dan, which I guess because he was on hand to dub, they figured they'd use that, which appears in a few moments. But they just ran this sequence through pretty much as is. What they had to cut was any scene showing Get Yun and James Tien standing in the background. So pretty much everything that didn't include those guys was there. And of course, for many years, this sequence was cut in its entirety from the UK release print because the BBFC, that sign in the background says Temple of the Tiger, by the way, or like Shrine of the Tiger. So the whole sequence would be cut from the British print because the BBFC had deemed that you could not show nunchakus. That's Dan's real voice. How do you like that? And in the full version, Bruce Lee says, "How do you like that?" But in this version, they cut away and move in here. And there's a sequence coming up when we actually get to see the shadows of the two guys standing in the background. But there's a lot of what they've done a lot of times is kind of shrink the frame. You see the shadow there in the background as Dan goes down. But they've kind of really cut into the frame of the original footage so that you don't see those guys in the background. But it was a great sequence, and Dan himself said he hadn't really done a significant amount of film work before, and came to Hong Kong with some trepidation. And but I think Bruce, knew the abilities of the people he worked with, and he knew Dan was up to the job. You just saw a moment ago, as Bruce was coming forward, that kind of log-like object to the back of the frame, and that's actually a weapon that was used by Get Yun. You see it there in the background next to the throne. And Get Yun used that and was defeated by Dan at the very beginning of the scene. Unfortunately, that footage isn't available now. Bruce looks across at Get Yun and James Tien. Insert shot there. And then the real Bruce runs up. And here's this scene, which, as I mentioned earlier, is actually used earlier in some prints of Game of Death. And it's the same reaction shot of Bruce, but actually we get some dialogue from Chi Han Zoi as he receives his challenges. And now it's cut together so that we only see Bruce in the full version of the film, the 1972 version. Bruce Lee comes up with James Tien and Get Yun, and there's quite a lengthy fight between Chi Han Zoi and the other two guys, and they obviously prove to be not up to their skill level is not sufficient to take him on. So Bruce enters the fray, and here we cut right into that, and we don't see any of the other guys in action. Chi Han Zoi was the instructor of Wang In-sik, Han Yan-gik, who had worked with on the movie Hapkido, as had Chi Han Zoi, and had also worked with Bruce on the movie Way of the Dragon. And I think Wang In-sik is a terrific martial artist. I mean, you can also see him in the film Young Master. He's the main villain in that film with Jackie Chan. And Bruce maybe felt that Chi Han Zoi himself would also be even better because he was the master of Wang In-sik. But they actually had quite a lot of problems, not because Chi Han Zoi is not a decent martial artist, because he obviously is a martial arts master in his own system, but he hadn't done film fighting. So his timing was not always what it might be. So you can see in the outtakes, Bruce getting a little frustrated sometimes with the number of takes that they had to do to get a scene completed. And throughout the scene, you can see in the background at the foot of the stairs the body of Get Yun, and in the original 72 version, he gets thrown down the stairs. We don't get to see who threw him down at first. We just see that he runs up. Obviously, he fights with Jabbar, or is killed by Jabbar very quickly and then thrown back down the stairs. Get Yun was a kickboxer and a karate exponent, fought in the ring, and he's seen in the movie Private Eyes with Michael Hoy, a very popular comedy, and then died shortly after Bruce of a brain hemorrhage. And not much else really is known about him apart from his involvement in these films and his involvement with Game of Death. Bruce registers the body lying there, which we don't really see that clearly in this version of the film. And there he is up in the Jabbar level. And in the 1972 version, the first thing he sees as he comes up is the flying body of James Tien, which is like lying in the background throughout this sequence. Now it's recut so that he comes up, he sees Jabbar, comes forward, gets the kick and the distinctive footprint. And there's a really nice shot that Klaus cut out, which is a POV shot of Jabbar in the rocking chair with the image of Bruce sitting on the ground, stunned, and the image of Bruce is going up and down in the same rhythm as Jabbar is rocking in the rocking chair. So I don't know why he cut that out, because I thought that showed Bruce Lee's directorial skills, as they were developing on what was his second feature as director. I noticed there's a recent MTV video for the band Sugar Ray in which they recreate, or they make fun of Game of Death, and they have like their lead singer in a yellow tracksuit. And Kareem Abdul-Jabbar actually came and played a part similar to the part he plays here. So it's nice, he's always somebody in interviews has paid a lot of respect to Bruce, and has kind of seems to have fun with his connection with. He's a basketball legend in his own right, but he has this connection to a martial arts legend, and they keep cutting little bits of dialogue back and forward between the two, as we are here in what they call the Temple of the Unknown, which is the highest temple of the tower. And you see this other staircase that earlier we saw James Tien trying to run up it. But as it turns out, at the end of the sequence, as it was shot in 72, Bruce doesn't run up the stairs. Instead, he smashes open some more panels in the wall and shouts out to the people below. Now, this scene, as you see, Bruce, it still looks kind of choppy when he comes over. I think he was going to use his acrobatic double, Yun Hua, to shoot an insert shot and didn't get to do it. And maybe they didn't realize that he was planning that. There's a little line there from Bruce, one word later, that was cut. But so that the moment there before with the broken vase still looks choppy, and they just cut together the footage Bruce had left behind. And I think he probably had planned to do an insert shot. And the rationale for this fight is that Bruce is really using all the abilities at his disposal to counteract the size and reach advantage that Jabbar has. And as it turns out, he has to go beyond that to find the Achilles heel of this apparently unbeatable opponent. And this is the fact that Jabbar is actually blind, or rather registers different kinds of light to that seen by ordinary people. So as soon as the panels are knocked out, he's now, you see him protecting his eyes. They cut away most of this because I guess Klaus didn't really want to go into the idea of Dr. Land having a blind bodyguard or a blind henchman. But that's actually the rationale behind this scene. And so when his sunglasses gets knocked off, Bruce, in the original 72 version, goes back and knocks out further panels to further incapacitate Jabbar. And this is another thing, a little footnote to the movie. Kareem Abdul-Jabbar, actually, the time he made this movie, he wasn't yet called Kareem Abdul-Jabbar. He hadn't yet joined the Muslims. He was still called Lou Alcindor. He's actually 7 feet 2 inches tall. And he actually appeared on the Matrix TV series in an episode called Shadows from the Past, playing the blind man. So I don't know whether this is like a foretaste of that appearance. And another weird coincidence, the star of the Matrix TV series was Carrie-Anne Moss, who of course went on to make The Matrix with Keanu Reeves. So there's in the original version, there's a whole sequence which was cut out where Jabbar's glasses have gone off, and there's a close-up shot showing he has these kind of pink albino eyes, and obviously has some deficient or different kind of vision. This was all cut, as was the dialogue exchange preparatory to this final encounter. And then this is the last we're going to see of the real Bruce Lee in the film, as he maintains a death grip on Jabbar's neck, and they ADR this really awesome neck-cracking sound. And of course, as soon as this happens, we cut away back to the 1978 print, and we see the the fake Jabbar and the fake Bruce. In the original version, Bruce kicks his way loose from Jabbar's body, staggers across, smashes open some more panels, and shouts out to one of his accomplices who's stationed on the ground below. That's the fake Jabbar. And then it's time for Hugh O'Brien to enter the fray. And if you look at the next fight carefully, it's intercut between sequences using the two Bruce Lee doubles, Tang Lung and Yin Bu, to fight with Hugh O'Brien, and shots of outtakes from the fight between Bruce Lee and Kareem Abdul-Jabbar. Because a number of times when Bruce Lee is meant, or Billy Lowe is meant to be evading the knife, the cane, you actually see the big black foot of Jabbar coming into frame. But it's pretty choppy editing job. There's Bruce in the original, in the Jabbar fight, and then Tang Long. And not really that good a match either in the set or the costume. And you actually see him, little excerpts of the dialogue that he was meant to say during the Jabbar fight. And Samo told me he had a pretty rough time working with Hugh O'Brien, because Hugh O'Brien had done in his Western movies, had done some, like his Wild West movies, had done like barroom brawls, but he'd never done any of that sophisticated, close range martial arts action. So you had to be careful, and also he was getting on in years at this time, so Samo was limited in what he could do. So there's a really funny still of Samo grimacing and playing the part of the Bruce Lee figure with one of the stuntmen on the set. So we go into this finger break here, and it's another stuntman now setting up for a stuntman. I think it was Chan Lung was the guy that actually went down the stairs, puts the foot in there. This is actually, and then we cut back to when Lee was breaking Jabbar's neck in the real footage, a tighter version of the shot. There is the top of the stairs, boom, and then the stuntman's going down. And that's Steiner out of the film, with Hugh O'Brien dead, and the fake Bruce Lee goes up to the next level, which we never get to see in the 72 version. Here it's the study of Dr. Lan. And there's something actually that was set up earlier, because before the theatre fight, we saw Dr. Land doing sculpture and implying that he has this skill. And in this sequence, what we're seeing here actually turns out to be a wax dummy. So a little bit of foreshadowing on Klaus's part. And Bruce coming forward there, and you see his lips move. He's about to talk during his scene with Jabbar, but they just kind of drew out these quick shots to register as reaction shots of Bruce Lee, when actually it's many years between the shooting in 72 and the shooting in 78. There's this next scene we see is actually on the rooftop at Golden Harvest. So this is on one of the sound stages where they have the mirror, and somehow Billy Lowe realizes that he needs to go through the mirror. This is the last real technique of the film, as he does this running kick through, shatters the image of Bruce Lee, something that people accuse this film of doing. Here we are up on the backlot at Golden Harvest. May it rest in peace. And Billy closing in on Dean Jagger. And another sequence that was tricky to do. And here's the street, a street shot elsewhere in Hong Kong. There's actually three endings to the film. The one that we're going to see now is we see Dr. Land falls to his death, and then the circle closes on him, and then we go into this really rather nice montage, also done by Christopher Strong, of scenes from all the Bruce Lee movies, and we hear Colleen Camp singing "Will This Be the Song I'll Be Singing Tomorrow?" And there's another version that was shot for Singapore, Malaysia, and certain other territories, in which we see Bruce Lee being arrested for the murder of Dr. Land, because in those territories you have to, if you kill people in the film, if you break laws in the film, you have to be arrested at the end. So even the Bruce Lee character had to be arrested. And there's a third version where we go from the dead Dr. Land to the Gig Young character saying goodbye to Bruce Lee and Colleen Camp at the Star Ferry. And the Star Ferry sails off, and there's a shot of Bruce Lee superimposed above the Star Ferry. So pay your money, you take your choice. But this was the international version. There's John Christopher Strong getting his credit for the titles, which we know one of the nicest things about the film. And they tried to cut together all the most memorable moments of Bruce Lee, like his first screen kiss, and him in action. Kim Schmidt there getting a credit. She, of course, became the wife, at least for a while, of Gig Young. And that's Jackie Chan going through the window. His major doubling job on Fist of Fury. And as we see on this print of the film, whereas in the Asian print, Sammo Hung gets co-director credit, here he's relegated to, this is Hong Kim-bo, that's Sammo Hung's credit on this movie, for his action choreography. I guess because contractually they had to put Robert Klaus as sole director for the international print, as Anders Nelson, the beginning of the nunchaku scene, who at that time was a youngster on his way to becoming a Hong Kong pop idol, and is still around in the music scene and acting in TV dramas. This is one of the first Hong Kong movies after Enter the Dragon to really feature a combined crew of American, Australian, and Hong Kong talent. So there you have it, folks. The guilty pleasure that is the 1978 version of Game of Death. And I think it's good, clean, hokey fun. So this is Bay Logan signing off. As ever, it's a pleasure to sit and look at these genuine Hong Kong legends with you. And thank you. Joy Gin, sayonara, and goodbye.